This video is about how to play chords. I will be going through a series of chord progressions that start with one finger, eventually use 2 fingers, and then 3 fingers. These chords will set you up to be able to play bigger chords that use all 4 fingers and various strings, and making sure that your fingers are up on the tips and doing what they need to in order to hit these bigger chords. Now, a lot of beginners I know will jump to what is considered the basic chords. They are basic in a sense because they are heavily used in music, rock music, blues, even metal, just any music really, even pop, country, reggae. These chords are used a lot, and unfortunately what happens with a lot of players is they find themselves frustrated because they can't play chords like this very well to begin with, even though they're a lot of times labeled as beginning chords. I don't consider these to be beginner chords at all. The reason why is because most beginners don't have the finger dexterity and coordination in order to be placing their fingers on the tips properly to make sure that all the strings ring out properly. What happens a lot of times is they flat finger, and a lot of the strings get muted like that. Even in a chord like the C, we'll have like a couple strings that sound okay, but you know, when you strum the whole thing, you can kind of get away with muted stuff. But if you're doing one at a time, you hear all those muted strings instead of sounding like that. So that's what these series of chord progressions will help prepare you for. If you came to this video through the ebook put out, the free one for beginning guitar players, this is going to have all of the chord progression examples up to when we start playing these chords, the bigger ones, and so forth. So you will see under each chord progression a link saying something like click here for a video demonstration of this progression. So anytime you click on one of those links, you'll be taken to the beginning of that chord progression that is shown in this video. So let's begin. First chord progression is going to use only your index finger. We're going to play open power chords, also known as 5th chords. So you're only going to be strumming 2 strings at a time, and we're going to hit each chord 3 times. The reason why 3 and not 4 is it will give you time to switch chords. Certainly, if you get comfortable with these chords, you are more than welcome to strum each one 4 times, but for most beginners, it's more appropriate and easier to play the chord progressions as shown on the screen. So we're going to play an E5, A5, D5, back to A5, and then an E5. Now, the root note of these chords is written in the beginning of the chord name. So the E5, the root note is E, which is played on the open E string. The root note of the A5 is A, which is the open A string. Root note of the D5 is a D, played on the open D string. So memorizing the chord names will help you learn where the notes are laid out on the fretboard. So here is the first progression. That's it. Just using my index finger the whole time. Once you feel comfortable with that progression, you can move on to the second one. This one is going to use your 1st finger and 3rd finger. These are also 5th chords or power chords, and they're movable shapes, because we're going to be playing an A5, G5, F5, back to G5, and then the dots at the end of the tab that's telling you to repeat what you just did. So we're going to be doing the chord progression 2 times through. So keep your thumb about in between the first and third finger, and then just strum those 2 strings that you're holding. So we got the A5, G5, F5, G5. Now, I do recommend just starting with your first and third. A lot of times I will just use my first and fourth for these 2 stringed power chords. But for now, because you're developing your hand, I think it's a good idea. Just use your first and third for right now. We will get to putting the pinky in. So a lot of times, guitarists will hear buzzes or like funny sounding notes. So a lot of times it might sound like this. So usually what happens is the ring finger is too far to the left. If you're playing a left-handed guitar, then it would be too far to the right. But basically, when you're holding the 5 and the 7 here, you want to make sure that your index is up against that fret, not on top of it, just right behind it, and then your ring finger is behind the 7th fret. So it starts to sound funny when people bring it too far back and start to hit the 6th fret, or sometimes they might slide it too far over and then start to get that string muted out, or even sometimes the first finger. So a good way to make sure that everything sounds good is you're going to use an arpeggio. Basically, you're going to arpeggiate the chord. You're going to pick 1 string at a time. You don't have to worry about the back and forth, just as long as you hit each one at a time. This allows you to make adjustments if necessary to make sure all the notes are sounding correct. So instead of just strumming the whole time, you can go back and forth and make sure all the notes are ringing out properly. Stay on that progression until you feel comfortable before we move on to the next one. The third chord progression is going to add the pinky. We're going to be playing 5th chords, power chords again, and we're going to be building upon the shape we've already used. We're also going to be using a bar chord for the first time. A bar chord is basically you lay 1 finger flat and you lay it across multiple strings on the same fret in order to use less fingers for more notes. So I'll show you that once we get there. So we're starting with an A5 chord again, and we're starting with the first and third like before, but now you see on the tab the 7th fret is marked on the D string. So we're going to put the pinky on the D string now. It's also useful to build the chords from the bottom up. So basically you read it from the bottom string up. So looking at this chord, the way I'm reading it, I'm going 5, 7, 7. 5, 7, 7. Basically I look at it as we start from the root and then go up from there, like from the ground up. So typically, we spend all our lives, reading a book from the top of the page down. Chords, we're going to do the opposite. Read from the bottom of the ground up. So 5, 7, 7, that's how I read that chord. So, let's get to it. So strumming 3 strings now. The A5, G5, now the E5. This is where the bar comes in. You see, I am laying my index finger flat across the the A and the D string. Now, some people like to use these 2 fingers or those 2 fingers, and that is possible to do. However, learning to bar can save you all kinds of time and trouble when learning how to switch to different chords, and it is important to learn how to bar. So I think now is a good time just give it a try. So just lay your first finger across the A and the D string on the 2nd fret. So this way you can play the open E, 2nd fret on the A, 2nd fret on the D. Okay, so after the E5 chord in our progression, we go to the F5, and then repeat. So here we go. A5, G5, E5, F5. Remain on that progression until you feel comfortable before moving on to the next one. This next progression is going to have a bit more challenge to it. This next progression will be using 2 fingers again, and I call these 2-finger major chords. And when we do these, we're going to be using the 2nd and 1st finger, or middle and index finger, and it's a challenge for a lot of new people because you have to have the fingers on their tips in order for the notes to ring out. If you don't, what's going to happen is the 2nd notes you're playing will be muted. So we have a C, F, G, back to F, and then we repeat that. C, F, G, F. So when you do this, you're going to put your middle finger on the root note of this chord, and then your index finger will be on the 2nd. To show you what I mean about your fingers being on the tips, you see how they're curled up a bit? A lot of beginners will just try and lay their fingers kind of flat like this, and what happens is they mute out that 2nd note. It needs to sound like this. So nice and up on the tip. That's the way you want the chord to be, so you hear both notes. And as described earlier, a way to make sure both notes of the chord are sounding correctly, just pick one at a time. So just one at a time, back and forth, and make the adjustments in your hand that you need to in order to hear both notes ring out properly. Now, some stuff that's helped students when they're having a hard time with this is I've noticed that a lot of them, they kind of have their wrist pulled back like this, which makes it very hard to get the fingers on the tips. So what you could do, if try this to help out if you can't get the notes to ring out properly. Push your wrist out. So you're going to push your wrist out. That helps you get your fingers on the fretboard more. So you see what happens when I pull away? I mean, my fingers are on the tips, but because my wrist is pulled back, it's my fingers still will mute notes that I want to hear. So put your wrist out. Push your wrist out. And that should help a lot of people if you're finding a hard time getting the notes to ring out properly. Alright, so here is the progression. You're going to use the same 2 fingers the whole time. C, F, G, F. The way to recognize if this chord is major is just reading the root note. A major chord will most of the time just be listed by the root note. So other ways you might see it is, for example, instead of saying just C, it could say C, then major spelled out in full. Sometimes it might have C and then just a capital M, or C, M, A, J, so just major, just cut in half there pretty much. Or, not seen very often, you'll have C and then a triangle. So that if you see a C triangle, that does mean C major. So stick with this progression until you feel comfortable with it and both notes of the chords ring out properly before we move on to the next one. This chord progression will use 2-finger minor chords. Now you can tell when a chord is minor because it'll have the root note of the chord followed by a lowercase m. There are other symbols for a minor chord. Sometimes you might see the whole word minor spelled out after. Another common one is just going M-I-N. Sometimes you'll see M-I. Typically it's just the root note of the chord followed by a little M. And very rarely you'll see a minus sign, so it might look like it says A minus. That means A minor. So these chords you're going to start with your ring finger now, and then index finger. So your ring finger is going to be on the root note of these chords, and then your index will be hitting the higher notes. And again, if you need to, play one note of the chord at a time to make sure the notes ring out properly. If you're having a hard time getting the notes to ring out properly, make sure that your wrist is pushed forward far enough in order to get the notes to ring out proper. All the chords in this progression will use the same two fingers. So we have A minor, D minor, E minor, back to D minor, and repeat. Here we go. A minor, D minor, E minor, D minor. Continue playing that progression as long as you need to until you feel comfortable before moving on to the next one. This chord progression is going to combine all the chords we've done so far except for the 2-finger fifth chords. We're going to stick with the 3-finger ones. So we're going to use the 2-finger major, 2-finger minor, and our 3-finger fifth chords. So this progression we will go A minor, G, E minor, F, C5, D5, E5, D5. Here we go. A minor, G, E minor, F, C5, D5, E5, D5. Now, when you're going through this, some things to help make it easier. When you transition from the A minor to the G chord, your first finger, your index finger, is going to stay on that G, the G string that is, as you go from this chord to this. So I'm just sliding my index finger down 1 fret and then replacing my ring finger with the middle. So basically I go from here, slide down 1 fret, and then replace the ring finger with the middle. So when we go from the E minor to the F, I am sliding up 2 frets, so this way my index finger is in the right place, and then replace the ring finger with the middle again. So from the E minor we slide up 2 frets, replace the ring with the middle finger. Now, after you've gone through the fifth chords and you go to the repeat, your ring finger is already on the note it needs to be to start the A minor chord when you begin the repeat. This is known as an anchor finger. An anchor finger is a finger that you can leave right where it is when switching between 2 different chords. So, when we go from this D5 to the A minor, leave your ring finger down and then put your index finger where it needs to be on the G string. I'll show you that again. So from the D5 to go to the repeat, just leave your ring finger down so your first and fourth come off, and then your first goes to the G string. So you're ready for that A minor. Now that chord progression will most likely prove to be a bit of a challenge for anyone who's new at playing chords, and that's okay. So that's why I invite you to stick with all of the previous chord progressions first until you feel comfortable before moving on to what we just did, because it is a bit more of a challenge. So again, stick with that chord progression until you feel comfortable before moving on to the next. This next progression is going to build upon the 2-finger major chord and add a 3rd finger. So the C chord we've done before, going 3 on the A string, 2 on the D string, that's still going to be used. We're now going to add the 3rd fret on the G string. So what I'm going to do, instead of holding my middle finger on the A string, I'm going to move that down to the G note on the E string, and then replace that middle finger that just moved with the ring finger. So I have the middle, ring finger, 1st finger. And this is our C chord in this progression. Now, I've mentioned earlier that the root note of the chord, that's typically what you do play first in the chord. However, sometimes we have voicings or inversions of the chord. And without getting into too much music theory on what that is, basically it's just you take the notes of, let's say, the C chord and you jumble them up. So you still have all the notes that make a C chord, but you're starting on a note that's not C. So basically what we have, the 3 notes that make a full C chord, not the 2-note one, the 3 notes, we have a C, E, and a G. So C, E, and G make a C chord. We're just starting with a G in this shape. So we have G, C, and E. So technically you can mix up a C, E, and G note any which way you want, and technically it's still a C chord because you have the 3 notes that make a C chord. So the more detail would be for a different lesson. So let's just stick with that. So we have this C chord, and then we're going to do the F, G, back to F. So we're going to have the same chord shape, same fingers the whole time. So middle, ring, and 1st finger. So here we go. C, F, G, F, stick with that progression until you feel comfortable with it before moving on to the next. This progression is building upon the 2-finger minor shape we've done before. So we did do an A minor chord where we started on the D string. We had our A note on the D string at the 7th fret, and then the index finger on the 5th fret of the G string. That is a C. So we had an A and a C to play this 2-finger or 2-note version of an A minor. But a full A minor chord consists of 3 notes. So you'd have A, C, and an E notes, an A, C, E. So just like the major chords that we just did with a 3rd finger added, we won't be starting the chord with the root note of the chord. We're going to be starting, so instead of going A, C, E, we're going to start with an E here. We're going to go E, A, C. So technically it's still an A minor chord. So we're going to begin this chord shape with the ring finger. So the first chord we're doing here on this progression, you're going to have your ring finger starting on the A string, 7th fret. Pinky will be on the 7th fret of the D string, and your index finger will be on the 5th fret of the G string. So we have, from the bottom up, 7, 7, 5, ring, pinky, index. And that's the shape we're going to use for this progression. Here we go. A minor, E minor, D minor, E minor, continue playing that progression until you feel comfortable before moving on to the next. This progression will be using the 3-finger major, minor, and 5th chords. It will be a bit more challenging than the ones we've done in the past, but just take your time with it. Try and be patient with yourself, and eventually you will get this down. So the chords we're going to use are A minor, G, E minor, F. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's just like we did before. We did the A minor here, G, E minor, F. Now we're doing the bigger shapes. A minor, G, E minor, F, and then we're going to go back to A minor, G, and then G5, A5. Here we go. A minor, G, E minor, F, A minor, G, G5, A5. That was the last progression before the bigger chords are introduced in the ebook that was given out, the free beginning guitar players ebook. So just when you're going through that last progression there, just little tips to help out. When you're going from like that E minor, or again A minor to the G, just like we did before, how you just sliding your index over, that's the same idea here. You're just going to slide your index over just that one fret and just kind of change between those shapes. So you might want to just practice go between those two, so this minor and major shape, and just get used to how that feels. So in the same idea, like going from the this E minor up to the F, your index finger stays on that string, stays on the D string. So that's a good way to get used to those chords. Just go back and forth between those two. Now, when we go up to the next part, into down to the G5, A5, you got 2 anchor fingers when you go from the A5 to the A minor. So the 3rd and 4th finger stays put. So you just go between having your index on the low E and switch it so you have the index finger on the G. So that's an easy way to transition from the A5 to the A minor, just moving the index finger. Now as far as going from like this G to the G5, there's really no easy way about it, because you have to take all your fingers off and just go to a completely new shape. So that's another place you can just practice going between those 2 chords until you feel comfortable with it. So anytime that you're working on transitioning from one chord to the next, it doesn't matter what chords they are, it's very helpful to just sit there and go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth as many times as you need to until your hand gets comfortable with that transition. So students of mine do that all the time, especially when we find that they're having a really difficult time with a particular chord or maybe 2. We just sit there and go back and forth between them. So it may seem really boring to do, but it's really, really effective, super effective. So another thing you can do, just to make sure that you're switching properly, again, arpeggiate the chords. So like going from the G to the G5, just do 1 note at a time. It's much more challenging, but it makes sure that all the notes are ringing out properly. So, quite a few chord progressions here, but there are so many others that can be done in order to help you progress in a nice, even way from chords to chords. So, when I do work with students one-on-one, we do a lot more chord progressions to kind of fill in the gaps of going from one progression to the next that is shown on this video and in the ebook. So if you find transitioning from one progression to the next too challenging, or if you have any questions with what is discussed in this video, please send me an email. I do intend in the future to have a full course dedicated to much more in-depth on chord building and chord progressions, as well as chord theory. As of the making of this, I do not have that yet. When I do, there will be an annotation up now to let you know that it is ready. But again, if you have any questions with this video, please send me an email. I'll be more than happy to get back to you, and thank you very much for watching.